Hey everybody, this is my 55-gallon gourami tank, and recently I added some ballast sharks in here. Now I know the ballast sharks are going to get really big. I've got plans for them down the road. That's not an issue. What is an issue is when I took them out of my quarantine tank, I had also just added some fish to my quarantine tank a few days previously, and it turns out those fish were contaminated with ick. And I wound up actually losing all of those fish. They were so heavily infected with the ick. So the ballast sharks were in contact with those fish in the same tank for 2 full days before they went into this tank. So there is a possibility that I have infected this tank with ick. It's a possibility, but it's not a likelihood. And I say that because of the way the life cycle of the little protozoan parasite known as ick, and I'm not even going to try to pretend I know the full name of it, but we call it ick. And if you know the life cycle of it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So tonight we're going to talk about ick. We're going to go over the life cycle. We're going to go over different treatment techniques and methods you can do. It's actually very easy to kill off if you catch it early enough. It's nothing more than a nuisance, really. But the key is catching it early. It can spread very, very quickly, and when we're into tropical temperatures with, you know, the kind of tanks we're dealing with here, its life cycle happens very rapidly. So we go from cycle to cycle to cycle very quickly, and it builds up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's first start with the life cycle itself, and we will arbitrarily start with the ick that is on the fish and the white spots that we know of and we think of when we think about a fish having ick. So what that little white spot is a cyst that has encapsulated the little protozoan parasite that has bored into the flesh of the fish and is feeding off of the soft tissue and fluids of the fish. The fish's body is basically trying to encapsulate that in a cyst to wall it off from the rest of the body, and that's important. That cyst makes the protozoa impervious to any kind of chemical attack at that point. So eventually, when it eats its fill, it's grown to full size, it erupts out of that little white spot, falls to the bottom of the tank, and then it encapsulates itself in a thick, I'll call it mucus for lack of a better word. It basically makes another little cyst that sticks itself to a rock or, you know, the plants or something, but it now begins reproducing. Normally, protozoas do reproduction by simple division. You know, one cell splits into 2, splits into 4, etc. But these are a little different. They create these little capsules, and I'm not sure how the division works in there, what's physically going on, but you wind up with hundreds or even thousands of little organisms in there, and when they're done, that cyst erupts, and all of those hundreds or thousands of little swimmers rise up into the water column looking for new hosts. When they encounter a fish, they bore into the flesh and they begin feeding and growing, and a little white cyst forms and appears as the fish encapsulates it and tries to wall it off from the rest of the fish. And that's the cycle. It starts over. It grows until it's full size, it erupts out, falls to the bottom, and it goes all over again. A couple things to note is when it's in the cyst on the fish or on the bottom, it is impervious to the chemicals. So the only time you can kill it with a chemical treatment is when it's free swimming. So you've got a very narrow window to kill it, but it's also a very narrow window where it's contagious, and that's why I said with the ballast sharks, I'm not too worried about it. The only way those ballast sharks would have been infected is if, once I had put those neons in there, the cysts had erupted, the organisms had gone to the bottom, had grown, those cysts had erupted, and then the free swimmers had come back up into the water and infected the ballast sharks. It's unlikely that that whole cycle would have happened within 2 days. When you start getting into I'll say even low-end tropical temperatures, room temperature tank, 68, 70 degrees. That cycle takes about 10 to 12, maybe even 14 days if you're down in that lower end of maybe 68 degrees. By the time you get up to 82 degrees, you get into the low, mid-80s, that cycle can happen as fast as 5 days. So warmer tanks can very quickly be overcome. One simple cycle of spores, I mean, even if it's just one simple spot that you've brought into your tank and didn't see, that one spot can produce thousands of little swimmers that will all, provided every single one of them finds a host, which in a little tiny enclosed aquarium, odds are pretty good. A lot of them are going to find a host. Out in the wild, it doesn't spread so rapidly under normal circumstances. Fish farms and aquaculture is something altogether different. But under normal circumstances in rivers and lakes, the fish are so spread out. The ick is nothing, again, more than a nuisance. It never really gets to these overwhelming numbers that kill the fish. One of the reasons it kills the fish so quickly, a lot of times before you even notice the fish is really terribly infected, is because the fish's scales help protect it, whereas its gills are very, very soft and unprotected. So by the time you're seeing the spots on the body, there's a pretty good chance the gills have quite a lot of damage already being done to them, and treatment is necessary immediately. As soon as you start seeing the spots on the fish, you need to start doing something about it, because very quickly it can overwhelm and kill your fish. Again, it's a strange disease. It's very easy to treat, yet very deadly at the same time if left untreated. Now, the ways you can treat it are chemically. You can treat it with copper sulfate. You can treat it with a variety of different things. I currently am treating my quarantine tank with a product called Ichthyophthirius from Corden. And it's an all-natural, no copper sulfate in it. I believe it takes a little longer, but it's just as effective. I've used it before. I didn't have any issues with it, so I'm going to go ahead and use that again because I'm not in any hurry to take the fish out of quarantine anyway, so I may as well use this sort of slower process. But I'm also not sure if it really is a slower process, and once I go over the basics here, we'll sort of get into the weeds a little bit of, various ways we can treat and so on and so forth. But remember, the chemical treatments are only effective during that free swimming period. So you've got to use it for, most things recommend 10 days or until you haven't seen spots on your fish for 3 or 4 days. Then you can stop using it. But you've got to use it for that full cycle because it has to be treating the water during that eruption and free swimming period. All the other time it's in the tank, it's not doing anything. It's just being in the tank waiting for those free swimmers, and then it kills them off. So that's the way the chemicals work, no matter what kind of chemical you're using, that's the way it works. You can also use salt. Depending how tolerant your fish are, depending on whether or not you've got plants in your tank and the tolerance of your plants, if you do, I think, a tablespoon per gallon, you go pretty far up on the, you can still call it fresh water, but you're putting quite a lot of salt in there. And I want to stress, we're talking about aquarium salt, not marine salt, but you're still adding a lot of salt for fresh water. But the salt will actually kill the fish through osmotic shock. I've discussed osmosis and how that works in other videos. I'm not going to get into that now, but salt is an option. If that's something you want to do, you can do a little more research on salt. I'm not a big fan of doing it with the salt method. It's just, it's easier to do it in so many other ways. I don't see any point in messing with the salt and throwing my specific gravity or anything else all out of whack in my tanks. So the salt's not really my game, but you can use it. It's also recommended, no matter how you're using, or no matter how you're treating, putting a little bit of salt in the water is never a bad idea unless you have the kind of fish that are really, really sensitive to salt. And the reason is salt fish need to take up sodium out of the water all the time anyway, and it requires energy for them to do so. So when they're ill or they're fighting any kind of illness or disease, if you've ever noticed, it almost always recommends putting a little salt in the water. And that's why if you increase the amount of sodium in the water, it makes it much easier for the fish to uptake the amount of sodium it needs. And it's just like when you're sick with the flu, you don't want to spend any energy you don't have to spend. You lay in bed and you devote all your energy to recovering from your illness. And this is the same thing with the fish. If you add a little bit of salt to the water while it's recovering from some illness, you're just saving the fish's energy to focus it on healing rather than taking salt up out of the water. What I'm talking about with killing the ick is not that little bit of salt, like a teaspoon per gallon. I'm talking about going up to the maximum amount of salt you can really put with fish and still have them tolerate that amount of salt. You can even do a short-term salt bath with even more salt in the water, and this will supposedly kill the fish because of osmotic shock. Again, not a big fan of the salt method. The two chemical methods, as I've mentioned, the more harsh, the copper sulfate method, and then the more organic method, follow the directions on the bottle. You won't have any issues with it. The other method, however, is by treating with heat. And treating with heat is interesting and easy and virtually free. You might have to pay for a little bit of electricity with your tank heater, but other than that, you don't really have to do anything except turn the heat up on your tank. Now, I did a video one time where I treated with heat, and I treated with heat to the extreme, and I did so to prove that it could be done that way with no other solution. I had a lot of people saying you can't do that, you've got to treat it with this, that, and the other thing. So I shot a whole series of videos where I treated with nothing but heat. I did it to the extreme. Like I said, I went up to over 90 degrees, but I'll get to that in a minute. And the whole reason I was doing that was to show that if you've got a tank where for some reason treating with chemicals is out of the question, or you really don't want to do it, or there's some reason you can't treat, you've always got the option of treating with heat. Now, what I should have done was a little bit of research on my tank and found out that several of the fish in that tank were not tolerant to 90-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, and I wound up killing a few of my fish in the process of taking care of the ick. I cleared the ick up a treat, but I also killed a few of my fish. So the way treating with heat works is if you heat your tank up to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, it will rapidly increase the life cycle of the ick. But at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the swimmers cannot attach to new fish. If they do not attach to new fish, within a few days they die. So it breaks the cycle and the ick clears up. At 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the swimmers will not reproduce. So the ick life cycle in the fish will still erupt and drop their little organisms to the bottom, but no reproduction will occur, and that will break the life cycle. If you heat it all the way up to 89.5 degrees, it actually kills the ick outright. So in theory, if you heated your tank up to 90 degrees the way I did, I don't know the time period, but basically by the time the tank is up to 90 degrees, I'm assuming all of the ick is dead. You know, the fish are cold-blooded, so they're not regulating their body temperature. They're heating up with the tank. So once everything in that tank is 90 degrees, the ick is 90 degrees, and theoretically it should have been killed. And by the next day, I should have been able to just bring the temperature right back down, and everything should have been fine. I didn't do that. I ran it up to 90 degrees and I left it at 90 degrees for 10 days. And it was brutal. My plants took a beating. Again, it killed the ick. But I just wanted to experiment with pushing things to the limit. I've never done it where I only ran it up to 85 degrees or 86 degrees. I've never done it where I ran it up to 90 degrees, but for a very short period of time, assuming I've now killed the organism off outright, and now I can lower the temperature again. But theoretically, you should be able to do that at 90 degrees. 89.5 kills the organism outright. 86 degrees prevents it from multiplying, and 85 degrees will prevent it from attaching to a new host. Now remember what I just said a moment ago. If it does not attach to a new host within a few days, the swimmers die off. So this idea that you've got ick living in your tank all the time, or it somehow lies dormant in the gravel and it's just waiting to be stirred up, is utter mythology. It's just nonsense that just keeps going around and around in the aquarium hobby. Even professionals will still say this, and it is simply not true. Ick does not live in your tank dormant in any kind of cycle, and a water change or something like that stirs it up and then the fish have a breakout or something like that. That does not happen. If you don't bring ick into your tank on a fish, you don't have ick in your tank. It's not ever going to erupt or break out. I did read an interesting one the other day. This was actually, again, by a professional website. It talked about how ick doesn't do that at all. You know, it was agreeing with what I just said, and says what really happens is, and then it went on to say that ick lives as some sort of secondary infection in the fish's blood or something, and then if the fish's immune system gets weakened, the ick can flare up and break out. I mean, they talked about it like it was herpes, and if, you know, a cold sore was going to break out on the fish's lip, and it was going to turn out to be ick, and then the whole tank would be infected. It doesn't work that way. It's a little protozoan parasite. It's not a virus that lives in the blood and the fish's immune system stays on top of it until the fish gets too stressed out. It just doesn't work that way. It's a protozoan organism. We understand its life cycle. We know how it works. If the fish does not find a host within, or the swimmers do not find a host within a few days, they die. And that's it. They're done. They're dead. So if you've got a tank, and let's say you have a tank disaster, and oh my god, every fish in the tank died from ick. Once you've done a water change and you've cleaned the dead bodies of the fish out and all that, let the tank sit there for a week and you're good to go. You can put fish back in it and there will not be ick in the tank because there was no fish in there for the swimmers to host on, and then they died. So it's not one of these diseases where your tank has to be ripped down and cleaned out and sterilized and your gravel doesn't have to be cleaned or anything. Let the tank sit there for a week at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or if there's no fish in it, hell, just run the temperature up to 90 degrees and let it sit there for a day or two, and you're done. Your ick is dead and gone, and the tank is ready to have fish put back into it again. If you do get an outbreak of ick that seems to come out of nowhere, I've talked to people over the years that have said this, and after pressing them and questioning them, I've always found out that something was added to the tank recently, a plant or some rocks or they went to the aquarium or the local fish store and they squeezed out one of their filters for me so I could get a tank started or something. It's always something. You're never going to have a tank that's just been solid and stable and sitting there for a year, and then you do a water change and somehow magically it appears in your tank. There is no such thing as spontaneous generation. So once you've killed the ick off out of your tank, it's done. You don't have to keep worrying about it. That is a persistent myth that just keeps hanging on for some reason. That's about all I can think of. Again, catching it early is paramount. Normally, one of the first things you will see is a behavior called flashing. It's a normal behavior in fish. You will see fish flash occasionally. They'll rub up against stuff or scrape against a rock or flick off of the bottom. Again, that's normal behavior. They're scratching an itch, possibly, or they're stirring up food, or they're trying to knock some off-walks loose. Excessive flashing, the same way, if somebody keeps scratching and scratching and scratching, they might have a rash. If you see your fish flashing and flashing and flashing, it might have something really irritating its skin or something. Start looking at that much closer. Out of the times I've experienced ick, the first 2 times I experienced it, I caught it before I even saw it. I saw the flashing behavior, and I started watching the flashing behavior, and after a couple days I noticed some white spots starting to appear, and then I treated for the ick. And then the other times it happened, I had some bottom-dwelling fish in the tank. And remember what I said about the life cycle. When these little swimmers break loose, they're on the bottom, in the gravel, in the substrate. They swim up and look for something to host on. And when you got catfish living in caves and living on the bottom, they are ground zero. They get overwhelmed with ick very quickly if you've got bottom-dwelling fish. Another point is in this tank I've got loaches. Now, loaches are called scaleless fish, but they're not actually scaleless fish. They have very, very tiny scales, and they're embedded in the skin. But for all intents and purposes, their skin is exposed, and they can be thought of as scaleless fish. So they have bare skin exposed, and those little swimmers can get into them much more quickly than they can into scaled fish. So that's another consideration. Again, ick is nothing more than a nuisance, but you got to catch it early, and you got to just be on top of it. You got to be prepared to treat for it as soon as possible. So I hope I covered everything. I feel like I've been talking forever. So I'm sure I missed a few huge points I wanted to make or something, but there's always tomorrow. We can always do more videos, and that's why there's a comment section down below. Feel free to ask questions or raise any points I failed to miss or failed to make, rather, or started saying something and went off on a tangent and never finished a thought. That's not unusual with me either. So feel free to hit that comment section, say whatever you want, ask me whatever questions, and again, there's always tomorrow. We can always do some more videos and catch up on the rest of it. So thanks again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. You never know what you're going to get with me, and I like to think it's all good, so you don't want to miss any of it. So thanks again for watching. See you real soon in the next one.